Just seen the weigh-in for George Groves versus Callum Smith, the final of the World Boxing Super Series at super middleweight. The weigh-in is pretty interesting. I mean, you just see the size difference between the two guys is massive. I mean, we knew this anyway. We knew that Callum Smith was an enormous super middleweight, at least in terms of his height and reach and stuff like that, particularly his height. But seeing them side by side really brings it home how big Callum Smith is. How this guy makes super middleweight is beyond me. And as you can see, he's more ripped than George Groves because of the fact that he's so big. If you're going to be 6'3", 6'4" as a super middleweight, you must be ripped to be able to make that weight. Whereas George Groves, a big super middleweight himself, doesn't have to be as ripped to make that weight. How much is Callum Smith's size going to be an advantage and how much is it going to be a disadvantage in this fight? One way it could be a disadvantage is because he's a bigger target, right? People weren't impressed by the way Callum Smith performed against, what was that guy called? Holskin? I think it was Holskin, the late replacement, the guy who was a kickboxer. He really gave Callum Smith a tough time in the World Boxing Super Series super middleweight semi-final. Gave him a tough time. And even Eric Skoglund in the previous fight that he had also gave him a tough time. But I think the Holskin fight was more surprising because people expected Callum Smith to blow him out, and he didn't. So off the back of those two performances, I can understand why people are picking George Groves strongly in this fight. The only issue with Groves is that shoulder. He's had surgery, and historically speaking, if you see boxers who have had dislocated shoulders and shoulder surgery and stuff like that, more often than not, the shoulder is never the same. And this is a shoulder that George Groves relies on. He's a very jab-heavy fighter. Throws a lot of jabs. Now, there's one thing sparring and the shoulder holding up well in sparring. It's another thing in a fight. Because the stress of a fight, the pressure of a fight, puts more pressure on the body. The mind controls the body. A lot of people might not understand this concept, but when you're in the gym, you're not under pressure in the same way. When you're in a fight, the stress, the mental stress can manifest itself physically. And you can end up injuring yourself in a fight when you are final training camp, because of the stress of the situation. So will that happen here with George Groves against Callum Smith? That's the question some people are asking. I think if it was a 100% healthy George Groves, I don't think there would be that many people picking Callum Smith to win. I think there'd be some, but I reckon it would probably be like 70-30 in George Groves' favor. In fact, I'm going to do a poll. Let me do a poll right after I've done this video and ask you guys who you think is going to win the fight, what the result is going to be. So, yeah. Groves versus Smith, huge physical difference. The disadvantage for Smith being so big is he's a bigger target. But the advantage potentially is that he might be physically stronger. If he can get on the inside against George Groves and impose himself, he might be able to do some serious damage. On the outside, Callum Smith is pretty slow. Let's be real. He's slow. He can fight side on. All right. I've seen him fight side on several times now. And that's important for making yourself a slightly smaller target because, 6'4" as a super middleweight is very big. So fighting side on is better in terms of defensively. But he's still slow. I don't think he's going to be able to shock George Groves with anything at long range. Then again, if he does, he's going to shock me at the same time. Because all the times I've seen Callum Smith, he's a pretty slow fighter. So I don't think George Groves is going to have too much problems at long range with Callum Smith from what I've seen of Smith. George Groves got good head movement, good reflexes. He can move around. But if Smith can somehow manage to maybe tire Groves with some body shots, because Smith was always known as a good body puncher earlier on in his career. If he can somehow get to George Groves' body, tire him out a little bit, make him more stationary, then Smith could start to do some serious damage and let those hooks go and the uppercuts and all that kind of stuff. He's a much more technically correct fighter than a Chris Eubank Jr., for example, because Eubank Jr. on the inside, when he fought George Groves, he was all over the place. He was a mess. Whereas Callum Smith on the inside is a lot more neat and tidy, a lot more methodical, And I think a lot more dangerous on the inside than Eubank Jr. proved to be against George Groves, where he was just sloppy and winging wild punches up close. Callum Smith ain't going to do that. If he gets up close on Groves and gets him in them same situations, it's going to be a lot more perilous and, dangerous for George Groves against the Callum Smith, in my opinion. I also think Callum Smith doesn't have the kind of pressure on him that Chris Eubank Jr. had. Chris Eubank Jr. put a lot of pressure on himself. His dad put a lot of pressure on him, and the public put a lot of pressure on him. And I think the pressure got to him. Callum Smith doesn't have that kind of pressure. And on top of all that, they're fighting in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. That's going to alleviate the pressure from both fighters to a certain extent, because they don't have their fans around them. In fact, some fighters like pressure. George Groves, actually, David Haye, they're guys who, for most of their careers, they enjoyed the pressure. They enjoyed the crowd. They enjoyed D-Day, crunch time. They enjoyed the fact that it was that. They thrived off it. Some fighters actually need it to enhance their performance. They need the pressure and they need all that kind of business. But other fighters prefer it when they're away from home. Like certain football teams. They will have a better away record than a home record because they tend to play better when there's not the pressure of their home crowd. Callum Smith, let me not say he performs better away from home. No, let me not say that, because he performed very, very well when he was fighting in Liverpool for so long. So let me not say he performs better away from home, but I don't think he relies as much on the crowd. That's my perception of him anyway. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think he relies so much on getting a lift from the crowd as George Groves might. I don't think he relies as much on the big fight buzz as George Groves does. Again, I could be totally wrong here, but that's just my perception of him. So it might benefit Callum Smith. It might benefit both fighters to not have pressure, but I suspect that if it's going to benefit anyone, it will benefit Callum Smith to not have the pressure of the crowd, boxing in Saudi Arabia and stuff like that. And also George Groves has been talking a lot about being concerned about being in Saudi Arabia, because you do hear a lot of, as George Groves says, horror stories about Saudi Arabia and all this kind of stuff. And George Groves has said since landing in Saudi Arabia, it's not like people tell you it is. It's actually okay, which is often the case with any country in the world. You hear all kind of horror stories about different countries and you go there and it's not as bad as your mind and propaganda has made it out to be. But George Groves seems to be focusing on that, whereas I haven't really heard Callum Smith talk about that. So that's another thing that some people might want to take into account when it comes to the psychological state that each fighter is in. Is George Groves a little concerned about being in Saudi Arabia? He seems to be a little nervous about it, whereas Callum Smith is just like, whatever, Saudi Arabia, no problem. Do you understand? Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about everything I've talked about in this video. It's Satman, I'm out. For those of you who are interested in topics outside of boxing, controversial topics even, you might want to check me out on Patreon. Today's podcast, which I've just uploaded, is right here. People are leaving comments already. And the topics covered, it's an hour and 26 minutes long. And I'm covering the topics of black men and white women, dating single mums. And in that section of the podcast where I'm talking about dating single mums, I'll talk about my personal experience of dating a couple single mums in the past. And also the effects of social media, the effects that social media is having on the younger generation especially. So I'll be covering all that in today's podcast, which is just uploaded 27th of September. And as far as Patreon in general, I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts a month. As you can see, quite a lot of them are lengthy podcasts, sometimes over an hour long. This is another one, Sexual Liberalism, Democracy, Religion, and Psychopathy was the previous one that I did on Tuesday. And, I cover a whole heap of other stuff. Q&A sessions and even Eminem rap beef with MGK, all kinds of controversial topics, which I couldn't cover on YouTube without having strikes against my channel, demonetization, and all kinds of other stuff. So I'm able to do it on Patreon. So check me out on Patreon, even talking about Alex Jones and, all kinds of other stuff. So check me out on Patreon. There is literally hundreds of hours at this point. There must be hundreds of hours of content on Patreon. you don't just get to access my new podcasts, which I upload twice a week on a Tuesday and a Thursday. You also get to access my entire back catalogue of previous podcasts, which includes my highly acclaimed, I think it's fair to say, Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. Yeah, you just go to my page, my Patreon page, and you type into the search box Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer, and you'll hear that series. And you make up your own mind as to whether it's as good as people say it is. There's that, and there's also, as I say, the weekly topical podcast, which I do, the live Q&A sessions, all that kind of stuff. As you see here, it says on my Patreon page, Hatman is creating podcasts for independent minds and critical thinkers. And that is primarily what I do. But from time to time, I will talk about music as well. That's another thing as well. I've got my music up on Patreon. A lot of you may not know that I used to make music back in the days. When I was younger, I used to rap and stuff like that. And apparently I was quite good. It's not me saying this. Let other people decide whether I was good or not. My music is accessible there on Patreon. It's all part of the back catalogue. So anyway, like I say, check me out on Patreon if you're interested in hearing me talk about stuff outside of boxing. Yeah, it's happening. I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.